Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi,
Hi. Good to see you. How
good
are
to
you
see you
today?
too. I'm slightly discombobulated because I just got back from Williamsburg yesterday, last night. So for a premiere. So I'm in post-travel.
Lots going on.
Yeah, what's so much going on,
Well,
but
good. I
super
know.
happy to be here.
Well, I'm so happy you're here too. I'm even a little bit starstruck, and I know you're such a busy person. You've got so many balls in there all the time with all these impressive projects. You are. I first contacted you a few years ago, I think because I was running salons out of my home. So,
Mhm.
I was, but I knew at the time about your archaeology project with the Hannah Callowhill Stage, and I know that you were really deep in it at that time. And I think, is it currently set to open in 2026? Is that right?
That is the plan. It may, so, my original plan was to create this concert venue, and we may be restricted by Philadelphia building codes, which is, fair enough. I'm not
Oh,
like, oh,
okay.
codes are terrible. So the current sort of plan B, if you want to call it that, is at least to open the front of the building as a small archaeology museum,
Okay.
because opening a performance venue in the rear means we have to have, for safety, exits in the back of the building, which we currently don't have the ability to get. I don't know how they were doing it before, but they were sort of grandfathered in before. But it's still going to be like a super artsy, fun, history-filled space. So, I'm happy whatever happens. But 2026 is definitely the goal, because of course 2026 is the semi-quincentennial or 250th anniversary of 1776.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. That's really
Yeah,
cool. Of course, Old City is like really the start of the whole city. Um,
exactly.
is
The
it
whole
true?
country even.
Yeah, and in some ways, yeah, I know. I lived in Fishtown, which is right by Penn Treaty Park, and they have all these signage up about that's really like a particular tree there is really the place where the whole city and the whole country
Yes.
started. It's such a historic city, so it's really cool that you're doing like an archaeology project in the middle, in the heart of Philly. And is it true that you found artifacts when you were doing it?
Yes. So the reason I was sort of thrown into all of this, as you can probably tell from my accent, I didn't grow up around here. I moved into Philadelphia. I married an American from central Pennsylvania, and we eventually moved into Philadelphia. And like, I like history, I'm interested in history, but I didn't become obsessed with Philadelphia history, 18th century history, until we bought this building. It's on Callowhill Street. So for people who don't know Philly well, it's right on the border between Old City and Northern Liberties, right
Oh,
at the northern end of Old City. And we were doing some construction, which involved sort of digging into the foundation of the building, and stumbled across two privy pits, aka toilet pits, cesspits, from the 18th century, which at the time they used as trash pits, trash receptacles for a
yeah.
variety of household objects. So those two pits were filled with thousands and thousands of objects from around the period of the Revolutionary War. And something very tangible changed in my brain, just picking up and holding these objects that had not seen the light of day in 250 years,
Mm.
where I just dove sort of headlong first into it, and became what we now sort of call ourselves citizen archaeologists. Sort of dug these objects out, processed them, put them back together, cataloged them, and started interacting with the archaeology community up and down the coast of the United States, who were very excited by some of the stuff we were finding. I thought what we were finding must be very ordinary, but it turns out it's tremendously exciting to all kinds of people. And yeah, so now I really divide my time As best as I can. I don't sleep enough. Between being a composer, a freelance composer, and being the citizen archaeologist. I like to joke, it's only a half a joke. It's actually not that much of an exaggeration. I get invited to talk about archaeology and speak at archaeology conventions almost as much as I get invited to talk at music.
That's impressive because you're certainly well known and impressive as a composer too. So speaks all the more to your archaeology chops. What was your vision for that as a performance venue, and how did it, like, why did you kind of enter into that as a project in the first place, and how does that maybe tie into your mission as a composer?
Yeah, well, I think we have a lot in common here because I the biggest salon, if you like, around Philadelphia is Andrea Clearfield's salon,
Mhm.
which she's been running for,
Yeah.
gosh, 25 years
She's
at
who
least.
told me about you, I think, in the first place. I was so honored and lucky to be able to talk to her one time, and she told me all about you. Yeah.
She's awesome. She was, as a composer, she went to Penn for grad school
Mhm.
some years before I was at Penn at grad school. And of course, I knew of her through the scene, and, you know, had some works of mine performed at her salon. And I thought, you know, what a wonderful idea to, everybody knows as a musician, it can be hard, especially as a composer, it can be hard to get your works
Yeah.
performed, especially when you're first starting out. And Andrea just took it into her own hands, which is something that very much appeals to my, you know, DIY artist heart, and just created her own space
Yeah.
where she could create an environment that, you know, showcases different genres, things that are, you know, not established enough to be in the big concert halls, and mix up different genres and all of that kind of stuff and really create this eclectic thing.
Yeah.
So at the time when we found this property, we were living in just north of Center City, to up in sort of towards Temple almost,
Mhm.
Poplar, 12th and Poplar we were at. And it was a very nice house, but Matt and I kept thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool to have a space that was big enough to have people over and do our own little house shows?
Yeah.
And we were really not looking for something as soon as we've stumbled across this place. But when we saw the real estate listing, we were both like, this is an opportunity right now. And we are the right people, or the only people who are seeing this building for what it could be. If we had not bought it, I'm sure it would have been bought by a real estate developer who would have just turned it into luxury condos and been done with it. But I, you know, wanted to have basically a small space that would be able to do a lot of the things that, you know, Andrea's salon does.
Yeah.
But if I could create it, see, Andrea's space, as you know, is in her own home, and she's amazingly lucky to have this gorgeous home with this huge open space. But there are limitations because it's a residential building. She can't advertise her salon publicly. And, you know, she has to sort of fly under the radar for a lot of things. And I was like, well, we could potentially open this up as an actual, you know, legit by code standards
Yeah.
performance venue, because when we bought it, originally it had been set up as a magic theater, so a performance venue that just did magic shows. So yeah, my original vision was like, you know, we would live above it and we would have this 50 to 70 seat recital hall, sort of small theater venue that we could invite friends to come and perform. We could rent it out for particular, you know, anyone who wants to come into town. Yeah, and so, you know, I'm still trying to do that. I'm still trying to figure out if it is possible. But as we've learned, you know, safety first. So there are lots and lots of hoops to jump through. And you know, I also talk about how when I first bought it, so we bought it in 2014. I was still in grad school, and I, you know, wasn't sure after I graduated if a composition freelance career, like how that would go.
Mhm.
Um, it's a wonderful problem to have, and I feel sort of guilty talking about it sometimes, but I'm like, oh gosh, 2020 and 21, my career, my composition career kind of went gangbusters. And so the freelance career took off in a way that I wasn't, I don't want to say wasn't expecting, but it wasn't guaranteed. So now I'm sort of like, if we have to walk it back and just have a museum in the front space, that's okay. But I do really love the idea of an artist-controlled space, where you're able to make decisions that are not necessarily based on like, purely economic concerns, but based on what you want to see happen in your city as an artist.
Yeah. Well, that's a powerful dream. And I think the location might be part of it because Old City, I'm sure, is so locked down for like what you can change there. But I know Andrea just brings people together from all across the world and it's a beautiful thing. So
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
yeah, I'm excited to see what that all becomes for you. And so in a couple of your interviews, I was just kind of flipping around. You have a lot online, but you speak about your music and how there's a political nature to it. And I wanted to bring that up and ask kind of what that means to you to consider your musical political,
Yeah.
and like maybe what your goals are there, because I know from firsthand experience that it's a really difficult choice and a road to choose to make political music from within, specifically within like academia and the classical world, as opposed to just kind of leaving it for dead.
Yeah.
Because you're saying like, let's not scrap all of it. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And like a lot of people wanted to do that with Shankar, for example, just kind of like
Sure.
done. But you have to decide, like, do you believe in this institution at least enough that you think it's worth maybe changing or is even capable of change? So
Yeah.
and you have to kind of act as a bridge. So I'm really curious kind of like what puts you right there and yeah.
Yeah,
Inspired.
I feel like I mean, my basic, applies to everyone, I think, who's making art advice is make art about the things that you are really passionate about. Make
Mhm.
art about the things that you have high emotions about, whatever those emotions may be. Um, it is not enough, I don't think, to make art about things that you're just intellectually interested in, especially when it comes to music, because I think at its root, it's a very emotional art form. That's the power, that's the greatest power of music. Yes, it makes you think, but it makes you feel first and foremost, even if you don't know initially what the music is quote unquote about. It makes you feel. So my initial, decision to write what might be termed political music, because it was very overtly about political situations, purely came about because that is what I was feeling very emotional about, particularly during the George W. Bush administration when I first started composing seriously. So as I'm a news junkie. I used to work in TV news, so I keep a finger on the pulse of the news at all times. And the news at that time, I mean, at all times probably, was making me real emotional about various things. Anguish, outrage, sometimes good feelings, sometimes hope and optimism. Um, but that's what I was most energized by. So right from the beginning, when I was in undergrad at Westchester University, I was responding to what I was seeing on the news with musical compositions. Um, and I do feel like, this was in the mid 2000s. There was definitely a little bit of advice that I got from established composers and teachers that was sort of like, political music is a tricky thing to specialize in. One of the things that I heard, you have to be careful that you're not going to alienate your audience, or, you're going to date your music to a specific political period when a particular issue was a hot button issue. And I chose, perhaps arrogantly, because I was in my 20s and, that's what you're supposed to be in your 20s. I was like, I'm going to ignore that advice. I'm very glad that I ignored that advice. But for me, it was a couple of things. I think that the attitude in in classical music, and perhaps even to a greater extent in academia, academic music, the attitude that music is somehow timeless and outside of a political context is a myth, is a romantic era sort of myth that has been put onto music, that prior to the idea that, you know, these great genius composers who I love, I always have to preface that I grew up listening to Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and idolizing those guys, that this music is somehow outside of space and time and universal, and, you know, will engrave it onto gold records on the Voyager spaceship and send it out into space because surely aliens in a distant galaxy will also listen to Bach and be like, oh yeah, we get this. This is like, this is very understandable and universal. So yeah, so this is like the greatest thing that human beings have ever accomplished. It's such a 19th century ideal that's been superimposed upon music, that these composers, for the most part, were not writing music thinking, I'm going to write something that in 300 years people are going to send into space, or I'm going to write something that 21st century audiences will still go to the opera and be, they were just working composers. And especially in the case of vocal music like opera, they are very much responding to political events and issues of the day and referencing that in their music, or making choices about subjects based on what's happening in the world at that moment. You know, Beethoven's Ninth could not have been created outside of the context of what was going on in Europe at that time, in philosophy, in politics, in, you know, geopolitical conflicts, etc. So I sort of reasoned that the idea that music is timeless is a sort of false idea that's been put onto music. I also, personal observation and opinion, think that if that is a primary concern for us as composers, it leads to a sort of blandification of our music, because we sort of try to take everything current out of it in this goal of universality, and you just end up making like very like cowardly almost statements of facts that will be true no matter what. You know, I always joke about, you just write music about how, you know, flowers are pretty and the ocean is vast and the universe is, you know, indescribable and awe-inspiring, and it's like, yeah, okay, you know, like brave opinions, right? And yeah, I mean, again, there's music that I love with those kinds of themes, but I'm like, is that going to sustain me, sustain my levels of passion and motivation through the whole process of writing a ton of music? I'm not sure that it will. So let me write about the things that I am really, really hot under the collar about. And yeah, it's this interesting, because we've had 150 years of this, you know, oh, classical music is above politics idea. You do find that you will come into conflict with that attitude in academia. And, you know, it is this sort of a dissonance, for want of a better word, of thinking about, you know, I love Wagner. I do love Wagner's music. He's problematic as heck. You know, I don't, you know, I don't want to live in a world where we say Wagner should never be performed, or Wagner should never be taught in school, or whatever, because I found that music inspiring and informative, and, you know, it's led me to learn about the history of the period and why Wagner was writing about these topics and all of that kind of thing, and it helps me understand our current world, even to think about that history. So I, you know, I very much believe like context is everything. Thinking about the contexts of the works that we perform, that we study, that we engage with, that we immerse ourselves in. also, and you know, being aware that all of those works have a context, and then extrapolating that to, well, and all the works that we write now have a context. And maybe that context will continue being relevant going forward, or maybe it won't be. You know, it's like I've written works on political issues. One of my first big choral works was about marriage equality, gay marriage. And I've sometimes had to field the question, you know, do you think that music will last? Like, what if that issue is no longer really an issue in society and that song doesn't get performed anymore? And I'm like, if that issue becomes not an issue, and this is fantastic. Oh my God, I'm so happy that that it's no longer an issue. I really want a world where people, I don't know, look at feminist music from this period and go, wow, that's so weird. I don't understand why all of these feminists were writing music where they were like mad about the current situation or calling for equality. Like that seems really basic. You know, the concern for a piece of music entering the canon, I think is not a legitimate concern and should not be a concern while you are writing the work itself.
Yeah. Well, it's all based in so much anxiety, right? Like, yeah. I wonder if you also have then like do you consider yourself to have a spiritual relationship to your music too, and maybe to music in general? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I consider myself sort of a agnostic atheist, right? Um, I talk often about the universe as a force, whatever that means, you know. I um I have sort of ideas about what is time? I mean, I
It's
could
time.
what is
Honestly.
time? Yes.
Is it
What
real?
is time real? Yes. I think COVID was definitely like a huge turning point for me
I
on
think it
this.
broke time. I say
I
this all the
think
time. It literally broke time.
it broke time. I realized like time is so perception based, and music being a temporal art form that I engage with, you know, along with these ideas that like, is time actually real? Or are we just moving through a space that already exists? You know, does this count as predeterminism? Or, you know, it makes me wonder, you know, especially when I'm up against deadline and it's 3 a.m. and I'm trying to write music, I'm like, does this music already exist outside of time, but I'm being forced to move with my, you know, inadequate ape brain through this temporal landscape that I can't understand any other way because I can only see 3 spatial dimensions and this other weird time thing that I'm not sure if it's real or not. So I've had several points in my life where I sort of talk about, oh, the universe directed me to do something. I don't know where that idea came from. It's like it already existed and I just followed a path that already existed. And I do think about that as sort of the closest I get to sort of a spiritual idea of how my life is unfolding or how music unfolds.
Yeah.
You know, I've also had experiences where, well, actually one that's relevant to something that I'm writing at the moment. Back in 2017, I saw my first total solar eclipse. Of course,
Okay,
we
yeah.
had a solar eclipse a couple
Another
of
one.
weeks ago. Yeah. And I had such an enormous emotional reaction to seeing that solar. Like, you know, full disclosure, I'm like this sort of sciencey space head going way back. When I was 14, I went to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama.
I love
And
it.
I thought for a second I was going to be an astronaut. You know, my parents had mapped out this very sciencey career for me, which didn't pan out, but I'm still very interested in science. So I went to the eclipse, you know, with like a telescope with a solar lens on it, and
And the
like,
totality of it, you went to
yeah,
see the whole thing?
yeah. And I thought, you know, it would be exciting intellectually, and I was not at all prepared for the emotional sort of soul gut
Mm,
wrench of seeing that celestial event. Um, and I talk about how it felt like it put me in touch in a weird way with humans of the past watching that for the first time, like this really primal reaction to that. Um, and I there were thoughts flying through my head that I was not expecting at all. And after it was over, I was like, okay, that was incredibly powerful, like just so incredibly powerful. So I'm writing a piece about called Totality, currently for Voce 8 and the King's Singers in England. And I don't know yet exactly how it's going to turn out, but I've got to figure out a way of making it, you know, it's not just going to be pretty, because some of the thoughts that were flying through my head were not pretty. Like they were almost violent.
mm, yeah.
um, yeah. And I've gone through stages where I'm like, grappling with the nature of reality and, you know, thinking that while I don't subscribe to a particular religion, I see, to me at least, this is all very personal opinion, um, that in many ways I think religion is a way of grappling with the nature of reality at its root. Religion, spirituality, like, you know, thinking about all the different ways that of thinking about the supernatural. It's grappling with reality. Um, yeah. And when I have engaged with that, I have had experiences where I'm like, this is confirming
Yeah.
that our concept of reality is much more malleable and perhaps less comprehensible than a true rationalist might presume.
Yeah, not really able to be put into language, and maybe transcendent. And I really appreciate how you talk about time.
Mm.
And like I could nerd out forever about this idea and this theory that time completely broke over the pandemic. I think that's related to how time became like linearized in the industrial era, and like
Yes.
industrialization creates this kind of 9 to 5 clock that we're all on, and
Oh
suddenly we're
yeah.
not all on it. So suddenly we're all shooting off into like different timelines.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
totally. Like the
yeah.
idea of like, oh, like capitalism especially, and how
Mhm.
that affects
It's
our
a
sense of
capitalism
time.
thing, or like a
Yeah.
colonization thing, you could say. Like, I don't know.
I totally have this at one point I was thinking of making it my email signature, but I was like, oh, it's probably a little too radical. People would take it the wrong way, where I'm like, urgency is a tool of white supremacy.
Yeah,
You know, this idea that our
facts, based.
yeah,
Absolutely.
our culture, which is one of like every minute, you know, we have to be aware of the passage of time every minute of the day. We have to, you know, even we have a Zoom at midday and we have to be right there on the clock at midday. You know, if we're at 12:01, we're late. And how Western European culture is really one that imposed that idea, like invented clocks
Yeah.
and and then imposed that idea upon the whole world. And still in other mostly non-white cultures, that's not a thing. And so people make jokes about, you know, time in different, you know, oh, they're on African time or something, meaning they're going to be late to a meeting, or they're just going to rock up whenever they feel like it.
Yeah. That's
But
interesting.
yeah, what is the correct perception of time? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like something that's very relevant, I think, to our practice as musicians
Of
too.
course, yeah, as a musicians. And I mean, basically it's an illusion, and I think it's very cyclical, right? So I like that you talked about, you said like unfolding, or I think of like becoming, which I think I borrow from like Deleuze and Guattari, but just like a process of becoming, you know?
Yeah,
And so it becomes this like cycle where it's never the same thing twice. So you're writing your music, you're penning it, and maybe it'll be performed, you know, God willing, 100 times, you know,
right.
forever after. But every single time even if it's the same performers, even if it's the same acoustics, whatever, you're
It's
showing
different.
up, that each performer is showing up with new experiences for the next performance or whatever. And so
Yes.
every single time it's like a layer of itself that's like cyclical, the same but different. And so I think
Yeah.
music kind of reveals that illusion in some ways.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I love talking about that too, because I
Yeah.
think about, music seems so ephemeral, because it's there and it's gone. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've got
Can't hold it.
recordings, but
Yeah.
yeah, you can't hold it. You can't, I have when I'm doing archaeology or when I love sort of home renovation, DIY home renovation, and I've had you like colleagues or my parents even being like, why do you do any of that? Like, why don't you just hire someone to do it? And I said, there's something really interesting about creating, spending most of my life creating this very ephemeral thing that you can't touch, you can't hold, you can't have in your hands as a solid object. And then taking a break from that by building a wall and being able to very physically touch it and hold it and
Mm.
sweating over it and hurting your fingers over it and all of this kind of thing, um that sort of illustrates, I think, the whole experience of being human. So I feel like I need both of those things in order to remain sane in whatever
Yeah.
this reality is. Yeah, there's something very therapeutic about grounding yourself by literally digging in the ground.
Yeah. Yes, it would be. I
And
get that.
yeah, and touching objects from the
Mhm.
past that connect you to the past. Um, yeah, that music cannot provide that same experience. Yet at the same time, one could also say that music is like one of the prime ways that we can, achieve immortality, if you like, as a composer, or that you can like reach through time by listening to music or performing music that someone created hundreds of years ago and get inside their head in a way that you maybe couldn't just touching an object. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's really special.
Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast, is made possible by listeners like you. To support this project, you can contribute directly through our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/Aquarian Music Witch, or consider subscribing to our Supercast page. With the AMW Supercast Content Access Pass, you'll gain access to a vault of exclusive content and other cosmic perks starting at just $5 a month. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, because music is mimetic, so it really can travel like that orally or whatever. But I'm also thinking of like, I see what you mean, where it's kind of like giving you the totality of experience to have this like material and this ephemeral. But also, I think we think of music like time-based so often, and it really also can be very space-based. And there's a lot about acoustics just in general in a space that I like. Do you know about like sound walks? I'm sure you've like encountered that
Yes.
concept of sound walks. I think that's I'm trying to write a book right now that's about making music more accessible to people, and I'm trying to write it in the framework or like using the language of magic. So I'm trying to say that like we all have music magic and we can kind
Yeah.
of access it. And then I have these like practical exercises. And the first one that I think everyone should do, like to start off with, but also just throughout your life, is a sound walk, right? Or
Uh-huh.
some version of a sound walk, because it makes you attuned to, it makes you aware of what's going on in a spatial environment, and
Mm-hmm.
really start to think like, are there things I can even change about this? And until you start listening in those deep ways, which is really like what composition, I think, and even theory is supposed to be all about. Maybe not all about, but like, but a big part of it is learning to listen in these ways that are much deeper than I think our society really ever teaches us to, or gives us the space to.
Totally. I
Yeah,
mean, it's
so
all, yeah, I mean, certainly in my late teens, I was doing a lot of thinking about, you know, what is the nature of prayer slash meditation slash
mhm,
spell casting, that
yeah.
it's actually all the same thing, right? It's
Mhm.
like a way of disengaging the part of your brain that is concerned with like very tangible everyday things and trying to tap into that extra dimensional space
Yeah.
that whatever that might be in whatever discipline you're in. Yeah, I definitely was like, okay, I did a lot of research on magic and witchcraft in my
Oh,
late
really?
teens. Yeah. Was practicing for a little while, and I was sort of struck by, I grew up going to a Christian school for 11 years. And I was like,
You were in Australia at that time?
yeah. So I grew up in Brisbane, Australia, and I went to a Presbyterian girls' school for 11 years. I was a scholarship kid. And, I was a little bit of a rebel. When I was 7, I announced that was not a Christian and I didn't believe in any of this, but I still actually really enjoyed learning a lot about, it's like, whether you're Christian or not, if you live in a country like Australia or America, it behooves you to learn about this very influential religious philosophy that governs so much, literally governs so much of what of the way we construct our society. I write music for sacred contexts, and it's often on the themes in Christianity that I very much believe in. The idea of lifting up the underdog and not being greedy, very basic things that I'm like, yes, 100%, yes. The sense of belonging and togetherness, and taking time to think about how we interact with the world and what you put out into the world and what comes back to you. And researching other religious practices, I was like, they all have this element of meditation, or taking time outside of that sort of very brainy area to get in touch with who you are and what you want the world to be. And this idea that if you get into that brain space, you can create a world or go some way towards creating a reality around you that is what you want it to be, that's making the world, hopefully, that's making the world better.
Yeah.
And there's definitely, parallels there to, particularly for me, like writing political music. It's like, what am I doing with political music? What is the point of writing
You're setting
political music?
intentions, yeah.
Yeah, it is totally setting intentions and, putting light and love out into the world. And I have, you know, um, I I sometimes tell the story of, like, during the 2016 election, um, a colleague of mine, not a composer, but in the music world, we had sort of a spat on Facebook, a political spat, where she basically was like, writing political music is not changing the world. Like, what you think is changing the world is basically like useless. Like, it's not active enough. It's not you know as useful as being a real activist, as really putting skin in the game, in chaining yourself in a protest or whatever it might be. And it hit me really hard that it was someone whose opinion I respected, that it really hit me hard that they were sort of criticizing my work, and I got kind of down on myself, especially after the result of the 2016 election. I was very much like self-examining, is this the right thing to do? Am I being self-indulgent? Like, what is this? And then again, talking about what the universe brings you, I had an incredible experience the day after the election where the men's chorus Cantu sang one of my works in New York City, the work about gay marriage that I mentioned earlier. And it was such an emotional, cathartic concert. So many people at that concert were crying and grieving and coming together. And then afterward, they approached me and said, so we've sung this piece about gay marriage all through the country, including like deep red areas in the South. And it's inspired so much conversation in a really good way. Not angry, yelling at each other conversation, but thoughtful conversation. And I think it was like maybe around the same time I got an email from someone who sang that work out west, who sent me this lovely note that made me cry and cry, that said, thanks for writing this. It gave me hope that one day I'll be able to come out to my conservative grandfather. And, you know, I didn't write this piece looking for that kind of affirmation, but it's like the universe telling me changing the world doesn't have to look like one thing. It can, if you change one person's life, if you help one person feel seen and included, that is changing the world. You know, the ripple effect of that, of giving that one person their power back or giving them confidence or whatever, can have a huge effect on the world in the long run. So it doesn't mean that, you know, you have to be doing just one thing to change the world. Everything changes the world in its own way. But feels like a very, it feels like what I was meant to be doing to change the world. Like, I don't know that I would make a really good, like, lobbyist. But this is the one thing that I can do. And I've been very lucky to have gotten like these very overt affirmations of like, you're on the right path. So that's where I suppose, you know, my sciencey self veers off into, the universe told me to do this, so that's what I'm going to do.
Well, I couldn't agree more personally, but I think that's like a really unfortunately common kind of take on music, and it's a reason why we get like financed education in music, and you know, like, let's put all this focus on STEM or whatever. And like, I'm totally a pro STEM person, you know, but I think that it's severely damaging to just take away the music practice and tradition. And it's not just because kids need a break sometimes at school. It's like a really powerful thing.
Listen,
I think. Yeah.
if there is one thing COVID should have taught us about STEM versus the humanities, it's that all the best science in the world, useless without the humanities.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so shocked that people haven't been thinking about more directly about this, because it's like, we achieved a scientific miracle during COVID, an absolute miracle. We developed a vaccine in record time that saved millions of lives in like the shortest time that the human race has ever done this and figured this out, because scientists came together and did this incredible thing. And our communications failed, and our humanities education in the general population failed. And people, you know, took the wrong stories away of like weird conspiracy theories and, you know, I don't need to get COVID, or like, you know, just the weirdest stuff. Like, the communication side of it failed. And so people died unnecessarily, because in like exactly what you're saying, we have devalued humanities education. You know, it's like when I see people, you know, oh, I can't figure out what's true from what's fake. I'm like, that is the basis of humanities training. That is like humanities 101 is like looking, like measuring for bias.
Literacy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're trying to say it all the time.
101. And like a huge portion of the American population currently alive and, you know, functioning adults have been failed by our education system, not being able to empathize, not being able to like read documents and figure out, you know, what is the perspective of the person writing that document, what is truth, what is not truth.
Yeah.
And so we had this real problem with people, you know, thinking about masks and vaccines and where did COVID come from and is it even real? All of this stuff. And yeah, it like breaks my heart to see people saying like, you know, oh, the arts are unimportant, STEM is the most important thing. I'm like, surely that experience should have taught our society that they are equally as important.
Yeah, I agree. Plus, just like speaking of that time period and the impact of music, there's something about hope that people need. There's something about being able
Yes.
to imagine better futures. And there's also something about community. And then you can also even trace it back to like any kind of major political like movement that's ever been has had music
Hmm.
behind it that helps it to be defined, that helps people to kind of understand what it means and feel in their bodies what it means to be a part of that community and that movement. And I think that it gives people a way to move forward that they wouldn't like it gives you the motivation in a way
Right.
when even to physically walk, you can walk to a beat and it's
Right.
what keeps you walking. And I think, but yeah, going back to just like education, I mean, it's really, I think you're completely right making that connection with the humanities to why we weren't able to communicate
Right.
at that time. And it is really, I mean, I was teaching at Temple and before that a couple of other universities like as a grad student for many years. So I knew many years worth of many iterations worth of like freshman
Hmm.
level people, maybe some sophomores, whatever, depending on the class. But uh that, you know, that's my barometer. And I was saying right leading up into the pandemic, like 2019, you know, those kids were, shouldn't even call them kids, but they were so emotionally intelligent, so
Yeah.
like I felt like we were evolving into almost a new species because of kind of the people that were coming up and the way they were thinking about music by then, as
Yeah.
opposed to when I started teaching, which had
Yes.
been like a decade of me, you know, and
Right.
and by the end of that, I was like, wow, like I have so much hope. And then the pandemic happened, and I've actually stopped. I taught online a little bit after the pandemic, and then I have stopped teaching since then for many reasons. But I am now kind of, I do still like have younger people in my life, and
Hmm.
I think there was a shift. I think there was something that happened in education there where the people that are
Sure.
starting to come up now, I don't think it's their fault, but it's like
No.
the lack of, I don't even know, financing, like all the teachers are so burned out. They've
Yeah.
changed the way that they do reading. And so now it's like you can't, and I'm also very on TikTok. I'm like criminally,
Uh-huh.
but there's a lot of inability to analyze any kind of work of art or any kind of movie or
Mm,
any kind of literature. People seem like incapable of reading a book with a protagonist, say, that is not meant to be taken as like a good person and
sure.
not getting that you
It's
can
like
have.
very black and white thinking
Yeah, it's like we
about
don't,
things.
this book should be canceled because the protagonist was a bad person. Well, no, that's the
That's
point.
an
Like,
anti-hero. Yeah, that's
yeah,
actually like a whole thing.
whole
And
thing.
people aren't perfect, and
Yeah,
that does, like, what a boring book if you just
yeah,
wrote a bunch of Mary Sue books. That's not exciting or like meaningful.
yeah.
No, I don't understand what you mean. I feel like, well, I mean, one of the biggest problems that I think we're dealing with now is like we really haven't grappled with the trauma of COVID and what that did to our entire society. And as soon as it hit and we were in the midst of it, I was really worried about our world. Because I think obviously this was sort of happening before COVID, this push toward the kind of authoritarianism in certain segments of society. And the psychological studies show that if people feel like their lives are threatened, if they feel unsafe, it pushes them toward more authoritarian thinking. Um, whether left wing, right wing, whatever, it pushes them toward more black and white forms of thinking because there is comfort in those paradigms.
Mhm.
You are told what is right and what is wrong, and engaging in shades of gray can be quite anxiety inducing for a lot of people. And feeling unsafe increases that anxiety, so it pushes people more towards that
Of course.
black and white thinking. And then watching COVID unfold in this sort of slow motion car crash, and I was thinking, like, this is bad. Like, the entire world is basically being told right now, like, your life is in danger,
And being
uh,
traumatized,
and
like
being
almost like
traumatized.
CPTSD. If I can
Mhm.
diagnose a mass of people, I don't think that's even, you can't even diagnose a group like that. But like
Right.
It's basically what it is. And part of what happens there is that you get like memory loss. You get like
Mhm.
inability to really function at the same level. And I
Yeah,
feel that happening to myself. And I
same.
think it's
Oh, big
happening on a
time.
societal level.
There is whole swathes of 2020 that I just don't remember. I'm looking
Yeah.
at like my diary and my photo albums and going like, I don't remember any of this.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was because we were all traumatized. I was traumatized and thinking about it that way. Um, so I don't know what the solution is. Like, I don't have a big idea solution, but I do know that in the moments in my life when I have been at my lowest, music was the way I started to heal, whether that
Yeah.
was,
You can process that way.
absolutely. Like I do have CPTSD from my childhood. So I grew up with a mentally ill mother and had some, very traumatic experiences in my childhood. And it wasn't until my 30s and I got therapy and my therapist was like, I remember, you have CPTSD and me, I pushed back really strongly. And this is something that a lot of traumatized, particularly women tend to do is like, oh, don't be ridiculous. That's something that happens to like war veterans and rape victims. And that never happened to me. So no, that's ridiculous. And that it took a couple of months of her being like, and then did you have that reaction? And like, oh, you're having panic attacks and showing me that I went, oh, she's totally right. Funny, she went to school for this and I didn't. And she's telling me she's the expert in the room and she's telling me about myself. And I'm like rejecting her advice because it felt like, like I was admitting to a weakness or something. But yeah, it's like I can track back through my life the ways that music saved me. When I was a little kid, when I was, a teenager having my heart ripped to shreds for the first time in a relationship. And at these moments of huge, global catastrophes, music is what pulled me through with that sense of hope and purpose and connecting me to my humanity and my empathy and, the things that I want to be and not letting the experience turn me into someone I don't want to be. So, I cannot overstate how important I think the arts are in that journey. I mean, aside from, yeah, it's like, this is like, sounds like such a capitalist sentence, but it's like, what do you remember from the past? It's always the arts, right? It's like, what do we have from the Roman Empire? It's the art. What do we have from the Renaissance period? It's the art. But that's not the point. That's like feeding into that romantic kind of like art is timeless and lasts forever. That's not the point. It's what the art can do for people in their journey, in all of the myriad things that we need to be healed from, in, making the right choices as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I worry about the world right now. It's like, it's a little terrifying and it's happening globally, which is another reason why, I think global warming also has something to do with that. This, at some base level, we perceive the world changing, the weather changing.
And the
And
pressure's on, like the temperature's going up and it
yep,
just keeps going up, like metaphorically
yeah.
and literally. Yeah.
Yep. I'd often talk about, I mean, this is like getting into dark catastrophe territory, but it's like here in Philadelphia, you can map the murder rate against temperatures really easily.
Oh.
When, yeah, when it's a really hot night, you get more violence.
That makes a
And
lot of sense.
right? And so I think about, and what happens when the entire world, little by little, is the temperatures are going up, like
Mhm.
what is happening everywhere. Um, I can't solve that problem either. But I am sort of committed to thinking about the art that I want to make being a response to what is happening in the world one way or another. Yeah, some of it's going to be me railing against things that I see happening in society that I'm really mad about. Yes, no, like without a doubt, because anger and spite are really powerful motivators, I think,
Yeah.
for everyone. Rather than choose to do something negative, I am choosing to like create music that people can identify with and use as a vehicle for expressing that emotion in a positive way, I hope. But there are also things that I'm like, you know, inspired by, that I'm like, we need more of this, you know. I am working currently as well on a climate change work with the Pennsylvania Youth Choirs and the
Okay.
Mendelssohn Chorus. And the text for that, this is nice time, positive story. The text for that is derived from interviews with the choristers in these young choirs, you know, K through
Oh,
12.
wow. I love that.
It was an amazing experience, and I didn't know what to expect going in. I said I really wanted the students, the kids, to be involved, because especially with a topic like climate change, they're the ones who are going to deal with it more than
Yeah.
people our age.
Their opinions are
So
relevant.
yeah, exactly. So one of the parents of the choristers is an environmental sciences professor at Temple.
Okay.
So she was sort of the moderator of these these chats with choir members. I exited every one of these sessions crying with hope, like with happiness and hope, because these kids were so switched on and like with it. And yeah, they were also expressing, you know, fear and uncertainty and doubt and anger and frustration at what was going on. But, you know, I was thinking about myself at their age and thinking like, I was not this engaged when I was their age. I saw the most incredible, like, empathetic discussions that I think adults having those discussions would not have been able to accomplish.
Mm.
You know, one kid was like, we all need to be making choices to drive electric cars and put solar panels on our roofs and things like that. And another kid put his hand up and said, listen, that's really easy for you to say because you are privileged and have like, he's like, I'd love to be able to drive a Tesla, but we drive this like old Toyota Corolla because my family is Black and underprivileged and we don't have the money to do that. And I was there with my heart in my throat thinking like, uh-oh, where are we going to go with this? And the first kid was like, you know, you're absolutely right.
Mm.
I did not think about that. And this is a really good point. So, you know, like basically retracted his point and said, you know, we need to think about as a society who has the power to change all of this stuff. And I'm like there in the corner going like, I have something in my eye. Like I've seen Facebook discussions like by grown adults, like older than me, that can't have this conversation as maturely as these 14, 15-year-old boys who are supposedly the least mature people in our society. Like, are you kidding? So yeah, I'm really excited.
Beautiful story. And there must have been something like, surely there's something that facilitates that kind of connection too, because they're singing in a choir together. They share
100%.
that kind of feeling. Like it's like a bodily connection that you have with people when you sing together. Um,
Yep.
and I think that is the foundation. Like there's so much aggression. I
Mm.
totally believe that in the heat, everybody's getting extra aggressive, but that's part of like people get scared. They
Yeah.
get animalistic almost because you're right, there's no stability, there's nothing. You want to grasp onto something. So you become like really ideological or something because that's some semblance of safety, but nothing changes when we're just kind of like going at each other and not listening. And I think
Mhm.
it really teaches you to listen, but also to like to engage on a human level. Because you also say like it's timeless, but it's, and I do think it's timeless in the sense that it's human. So the whole
Mhm.
time there's humans, there's music, you know,
Yes.
and that's incredibly powerful and good for them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like so hopeful.
Yeah, I cannot even begin to express like, you know, grappling with an issue like climate change. It's really easy for an artist to just get completely hopeless because it's terrifying. You read all these studies and you're just like, you like thrown into depression thinking about what's to come and how powerless you are. But these kids like buoyed me up And I was like, okay, I'm going to write this piece for them, in the hope that, you know, if I can save them a few more minutes of not falling into powerless depression, and to like give them, you know, their own affirmation of keep going down this path and you can save us, you know, in some, or save yourselves, or at least try making the world better. Yeah, it's all them. It's not me. I'm just reflecting their words back at them and going, this, this is the way. So yeah, and you're right about choir particularly. There's studies that show that singing in a group changes your brain chemistry, makes you more community minded, makes you more empathetic. And God, do we need more of that? So you know, and it also teaches you to listen, teaches you to take turns, teaches you when to hold the mic and when to pass it,
Yeah, good point.
in a very active way.
Absolutely. And I'm also sure that COVID, because I know there were a couple issues with students of music coming back to school after COVID, and like having issues after they had not been in bands, choirs, or orchestras, or anything like that for a few years. And they were struggling with things like hearing vertical harmonies, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that that was really isolating on a different level, but hopefully people are coming back in, and even virtually being able to sing together, I think still provides some sense of community. So
Yeah. Yeah. I hope, you know, humans are resilient. Um, Obviously, as a species, we are like this weird dominant ape species on the planet now that's like taken over every single space on the planet. We are very resilient. We're very resourceful. We can do a lot. Um, and yeah, it's up to us at this point what we do with our many gifts.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. It's a little bit past the hour. So I want to be mindful of that. And I've been aware of you as a Philly-based composer for a while, but I'm leaving this conversation with an even deeper appreciation of your artistry and your dedication to the changes you want to make in this world. So just thank you very much for your time and
Oh,
for
you're so welcome.
sharing with us.
This
Really
has been a
well.
pleasure. I'm so happy that we were able to connect randomly on a podcast.
Yeah, small world, I guess. Yeah.
But yeah, you know, keep your eyes peeled, and you know, I love Philadelphia to death.
Yeah.
I am like married to the city now as well. So you know, this is the place, this is the time.
Special place. Well, I can't wait. And thank you so much again.
You're very welcome. Thank you.